I never thought a cracked driveway would expose a $118,000 secret sitting right inside my own neighborhood. But that is exactly what happened. One morning, I walked outside expecting to see a crew fixing the roads we all paid for, and instead I watched them rebuild a perfect stretch of pavement that led to only one person's house. And the strangest part was, every single one of us had paid for it. My name is Daniel Harper, and for years I lived in a quiet little ranch-style home outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, in a community called Willow Creek Estates. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved when they drove by, where kids rode bikes until sunset, and where most of us believed our HOA was just there to keep things organized. We had 42 homes, private roads, shared maintenance costs, and a board that always talked about protecting property values. I was never the guy who complained at meetings. Honestly, I was usually the guy sitting in the back hoping the meeting would end before my coffee got cold. I had a job, a family, a lawn that was always 1 week away from needing attention, and I really didn't have time to fight over every little neighborhood issue. Our roads weren't perfect, but they weren't falling apart either. There were cracks here and there, a few spots where rainwater collected after storms, but nothing that made you think the entire community was in danger. Then one Tuesday morning, I opened my mailbox and found a thick envelope sitting there. It wasn't like a normal HOA notice. It had expensive-looking paper, a gold logo stamped on the front, the kind of thing that made it feel more like an invitation to a wedding than a bill. Inside was a letter announcing a major road restoration project. The HOA claimed our roads needed immediate resurfacing and drainage correction, and every homeowner would be responsible for a special assessment of $2,800. Now, $2,800 is not pocket change, but I understood the argument. Roads cost money. Maintenance costs money. If everyone benefits, everyone contributes. That was the deal we all signed up for. A week later, the HOA held a presentation. The board president, a woman named Evelyn Cross, stood in front of the room with a polished smile and a slideshow full of dramatic photos showing damaged pavement, standing water, and supposed safety concerns. Evelyn was the kind of person who always looked prepared. Perfect hair, perfect outfit, perfect binder, sitting in front of her like it was a shield. She had a way of speaking that made every decision sound like it had already been made by someone smarter than everyone else in the room. She said things like, "We have to act now before this becomes a much bigger financial burden." And honestly, most people nodded along. Nobody wanted to be the person arguing against fixing roads. The vote passed easily. I remember walking out thinking, well, at least we'll finally have smooth streets around here. 2 months later, the construction crews arrived. It was early morning, the kind of cool Colorado morning where you can see your breath for a few seconds before the sun warms everything up. I walked outside with a cup of coffee expecting to hear machinery everywhere. I figured the whole neighborhood would be torn up for weeks. Instead, I heard a strange silence. The machines were working, but not where I expected. I walked toward the sound and stopped. They weren't touching the main roads. They weren't repairing the cracks in front of dozens of homes. They were working on one short section, maybe 200 feet long, leading directly toward Evelyn Cross's property. The new asphalt was dark, smooth, and almost shiny under the morning sun. It looked like a luxury driveway. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood was exactly the same. Faded pavement, old cracks, and puddles waiting for the next storm. I stood there for a minute thinking maybe I was missing something. Maybe this was phase one. Maybe there was some logical explanation. So I walked over to the foreman and asked, "Hey, just curious, when does the rest of the neighborhood start?" He looked at me, checked his paperwork, and shrugged. "We're only contracted for this section." I laughed a little because I honestly thought he was joking. This section meaning what exactly? He pointed down the road. Lot 12 Access Road. My stomach dropped a little because I knew whose lot that was. Evelyn Cross's house. I went home that morning, trying to convince myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe there was something I didn't know. Maybe the HOA had a reason. Maybe there was an explanation buried somewhere in the paperwork. But over the next few days, that feeling kept bothering me. It wasn't the new pavement that bothered me. It was the fact that we had all paid for something we weren't getting. At the next HOA meeting, I raised my hand and asked a simple question. "Can we see the full contract and the project schedule?" Evelyn smiled calmly and said, "Daniel, this is a large project. Everything is moving according to plan. Phase 2 will begin shortly." I looked around the room and noticed people exchanging confused looks. Nobody had seen a schedule. Nobody had seen maps. Nobody knew what Phase 2 actually meant. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a neighbor asking a question and started feeling like someone who needed answers. Because sometimes the biggest problems don't begin with a lie that sounds suspicious. They begin with a story that sounds reasonable enough for everyone to believe. And I was about to find out that the story our HOA had told us was only the first layer of something much bigger. I spent the next few days trying to ignore that feeling in my gut. But anyone who has ever lived in a small community knows something about neighborhoods. People notice things. They notice when a house gets painted a different color, when someone buys a new truck, when a dog starts barking at midnight, and they definitely notice when the neighborhood collects over $100,000 for a road project that somehow only reaches one driveway. At first, most people were hesitant to question anything. That is the strange thing about HOAs. They are built on trust, and trust can be a very powerful thing. When someone walks into a room wearing a nice suit, holding a folder, and speaking confidently about protecting everyone's investment, people naturally want to believe them. Nobody wants to imagine that the person sitting at the front of the room, the person responsible for managing community money, might be putting personal interests ahead of everyone else. But once I started asking questions, I realized I wasn't the only one who had noticed. My neighbor Frank Dalton, who lived 3 houses down from me, stopped me while I was checking my mailbox one afternoon. He leaned against his truck and said, "Daniel, am I crazy? Or did they really only fix the road going to Evelyn's place?" I laughed because hearing someone else say it out loud made it feel more real. I was hoping I was the only one thinking that, I told him. Frank shook his head and said, "My wife and I paid that assessment because we thought the whole neighborhood was getting repaired. I didn't pay $3,000 to make someone's driveway prettier." That conversation was the first crack in the wall of silence. After that, I started talking to more neighbors. Some had questions, some were angry, some were embarrassed because they admitted they had noticed something strange but didn't want to be the person causing drama. And honestly, I understood that feeling. Nobody wants to be labeled the difficult neighbor. Nobody wants to walk into a meeting and become the person everyone thinks is trying to start a fight. But there's a difference between causing trouble and asking where your money went. So I did what I probably should have done from the beginning. I requested the records. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't make a scene. I simply asked for the documents related to the road project, including the contract, the scope of work, invoices, and payment records. Under Colorado's Common Interest Ownership Act, homeowners have the right to review certain HOA records, and I figured there had to be a reasonable explanation somewhere. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe the contractor misunderstood the instructions. Maybe Evelyn's road was just the first phase, and the rest was scheduled. I wanted to believe that because the alternative meant someone had intentionally misled an entire neighborhood. 3 days later, I received an email from the HOA management company. Attached was a large PDF file. I opened it expecting to find a simple explanation. Instead, I found something that made me sit back in my chair and read the same page 3 times. The first document was the invoice from Mountain Ridge Paving Solutions. The total amount was $118,000. That number immediately caught my attention because that was almost exactly the amount we had collected from homeowners. But the invoice was vague. There were no detailed addresses, no complete neighborhood map, no breakdown showing which roads would be repaired, just a general description of pavement work. That alone bothered me. But then I found the work order attached behind it, and that was the moment everything changed. The actual scope of work wasn't for Willow Creek Estates. It wasn't for all 42 homes. It wasn't even for the majority of the community. It was specifically listed as spot repair and seal coating. Lot 12 Access Road. I stared at those words. Lot 12. I didn't need to look up the address. I already knew. That was Evelyn Cross's property. For a few seconds, I just sat there in my home office listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen. It wasn't anger that hit me first. It was disappointment. Because this wasn't some random mistake on a spreadsheet. This wasn't a contractor misunderstanding a map. Someone had created a project, collected money from everyone, and approved work that benefited one person. And the worst part was, they wrapped it in the language of community improvement. They didn't say, "Everyone, we need to pay to fix the president's private access road." They called it a restoration project. They showed us pictures. They held a vote. They made it sound like we were all participating in something important. I printed every page of the documents and started highlighting the sections that mattered. I highlighted the work order. I highlighted the missing details. I highlighted the difference between what we were told and what was actually written. Then I started walking door to door. I didn't go around screaming accusations. I simply knocked, handed people the paperwork, and said, "I think you should see this." The reactions were almost identical. First confusion, then silence, then that slow moment when someone realizes they understand exactly what they are looking at. One neighbor named Rachel Monroe looked at the document and whispered, "So we all paid for her road?" I didn't answer because the paperwork was already speaking for itself. Within a week, 29 homeowners signed a request for an emergency HOA meeting. That number surprised even me. I expected frustration. I didn't expect that many people to immediately stand together. The meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday night. Evelyn walked in, looking completely calm, almost annoyed, like she believed this was just another complaint she could talk her way through. She placed her binder on the table, adjusted her glasses, and said, "I think there has been some confusion regarding the project." That sentence alone made several people exchange looks. Because when someone says there has been confusion, sometimes what they really mean is that people have started asking questions. I placed the documents on the table in front of her. "Then maybe you can help clear it up," I said. "Can you explain why the contract we paid for only lists Lot 12 Access Road?" The room went quiet. Evelyn looked down at the paper, then back up at me. "Daniel, you don't understand the complexities of infrastructure planning." I smiled because that was exactly the kind of answer I expected. Not a denial, not an explanation, just a way to make the question sound too complicated to ask. I replied, "Maybe I don't understand infrastructure planning, but I do understand an invoice, and I understand that everyone here paid for a project that wasn't described honestly." For the first time, I saw her confidence slip, just for a second, but it was enough. Then something happened that none of us expected. The county HOA ombudsman, a woman named Patricia Wells, who had been invited after several homeowners requested outside review, opened her folder and began reading through the documents. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply looked at the board and said, "Community funds cannot be used for undisclosed limited work benefiting a single property owner." The room went completely silent. The treasurer, Mark Ellison, who had spent months defending the project, suddenly looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. His face changed. He wasn't angry anymore. He looked worried. Patricia continued reviewing the paperwork, page by page, while the board members sat there realizing this was no longer just an uncomfortable neighborhood argument. This was now a documentation problem, and documentation is something that confidence and a nice presentation cannot erase. The next morning, the HOA's bank account was frozen pending review. The remaining $74,000 from the project funds was locked down while investigators examined how the money had been approved and spent. For the first time in months, homeowners felt like they had a voice again. But the fight wasn't over yet, because even though we had uncovered the truth, we still had to answer the biggest question. What happens when the people responsible for protecting a community are the same people who put that community at risk? In the weeks that followed, our neighborhood went through something I never expected when I first moved there. People who normally just waved from across the street started having real conversations. The funny thing about a community is that sometimes everyone can be standing next to each other for years, sharing the same roads, the same sidewalks, the same problems, and still not realize how disconnected they have become. It took a missing piece of asphalt and a questionable contract to remind us that a neighborhood is not built by perfect lawns or fancy signs at the entrance. It is built by people paying attention. After the review was completed, the old road contract was officially canceled. A new vote was scheduled, but this time, everything was different. No glossy presentation, no vague promises, no phrases like, "Trust us. It's already handled." Every document was available. Every homeowner could see exactly where the money was going. The new plan included the entire neighborhood, with clear timelines, independent oversight, and a detailed breakdown of every dollar. It was the kind of transparency we should have had from the beginning. Evelyn Cross eventually resigned from the HOA board, saying she needed to step away because of personal health concerns. Some neighbors believed that was the end of the story. Others thought she left because she knew she couldn't defend what happened anymore. I don't know what was going on inside her head. And honestly, I don't think anyone outside that room ever will. Maybe she convinced herself that improving access to her property was somehow connected to improving the neighborhood. Maybe power slowly changed the way she saw the rules. Maybe she believed nobody would look closely enough to question her decisions. But that is the dangerous thing about small amounts of authority. Sometimes people forget that being trusted with responsibility does not mean they own the responsibility. 2 months later, new crews arrived. This time, they didn't stop at Lot 12. They worked from one end of Willow Creek Estates to the other. They repaired the cracked sections, fixed the drainage problems, and resurfaced the roads that everyone had originally believed they were paying for. I remember standing outside my house on the morning they finished my street. My truck tires rolled over fresh pavement, and there was this smooth hum underneath the wheels that made me smile. It was such a simple sound, but after everything that happened, it felt like more than just a road being repaired. It felt like a reminder that ordinary people can still push back when something doesn't feel right. Looking back, the biggest lesson wasn't about asphalt or contracts or even the HOA board. It was about how easy it is for people to stay silent when they assume someone else is watching. We all thought someone else would ask the questions. Someone else would check the paperwork. Someone else would notice if something didn't add up. But sometimes someone else has to be you. And I still think about that first morning when I saw the brand new road leading only to Evelyn's house. At the time, I thought I was looking at a construction mistake. I didn't realize I was looking at a test of whether we cared enough to find out the truth. Because communities don't fall apart because of cracks in the pavement, they fall apart when people stop caring who is standing on the other side of those cracks. So now, every time I drive down our street and feel those tires glide over smooth pavement, I don't think about the money we almost lost. I think about the moment 29 homeowners decided that asking questions matter more than avoiding conflict. And I'm curious what you would have done if you were in my position. Would you have confronted the HOA immediately, or would you have waited and trusted the process? Do you think Evelyn crossed a line, or do you think there was another explanation for what happened? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Because these situations are never just about one road or one person. They are about trust, fairness, and what happens when ordinary neighbors decide they deserve honest answers. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to share it with someone who believes accountability matters. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life community stories where the truth eventually finds its way to the surface.